So this chat is probably going to be about your past
Okay,
or some of the challenges that you had to go through,
sure.
basically.
That works.
So let's go with the first thing. I think I got about six things that I'm going to ask you pretty much.
Sure.
The first one is, what do you think are the necessary traits? Maybe if you maybe you can even give a top three that helped you persist to challenges at the beginning as a
Sure.
developer.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it's a little bit. It was obviously it was different for me starting out. For context, I got started. I live in the Midwest, in the U.S., a small town, Missouri. I didn't know any adults who did it in terms of game programming or programming in general. We didn't really have
And
like
you started fairly early.
I got started as a preteen. I was 12. But I didn't really have any sort of adult mentorship. And this was before the internet was any good. This was like mid 90s. And so, I mean, BBS and things existed, but like as a kid, I didn't really have access to that. I had like a terrible modem, not much knowledge about the internet, whatever. So mainly learned from books. And I think that was just sort of a positive trait my mom had instilled early on of like, we're a reading family. Like we read, she's always got a book with her. She's always reading. And so I just kind of felt very comfortable as to like, that was what I did in my spare time. I would like kind of sit off at the playground in the corner. I'd be that kid with their book open, just trying to like scrape away whatever I could. And obviously I was a child, so like lots of it went over my head. But whatever could stick, trying to figure out like, okay, what can I do with this? And some of my first like kind of closest to game programming stuff was I think it was C for Dummies by Dan Gookin. In the back there was a little section of like how to make kind of a just get a drunkard to randomly move around near a flagpole, and it was letters. It was all ASCII art. Um, but I was like, oh, I can do positions, and like I can do positions, then like I could keep track of the positions and make kind of a snake tail, and like that sort of led to my first one of my first projects was Fugitive. It was a little two-player snake game in DOS, and that was a mixture of both, again, like kind of comfort grappling onto whatever I could that was kind of working for me, but then also that I was showing it to my friends. It was like even though I was kind of comfortable kind of learning on my own, my friends weren't programming games and didn't have other people who were interested in making games. They would come over and make it two players so we could play it together. They'd have ideas for
Oh,
features and power ups, and we would
absolutely.
like add those. And I felt like having an audience of two or three people I really cared about really made a huge difference for me. Versus I think a lot of people, just because of the way the internet's structured, their first instinct is like, my audience should be thousands of strangers, and it's tough to gauge
Yeah,
like, do they care and like, are they paying attention and do they understand or appreciate like what's going on here? Versus like, again, my friends, they didn't even care about the tech side or difficulty. They're just like, this is neat. What's
yeah,
DeLeon been
but
doing? You know,
what I'm curious about is, were they actually honest when they were actually giving you feedback?
sure. Now, and again, granted, like, and I think it's fair to qualify that like they also at the time we were playing Super Nintendo games or whatever at the time, and so they understood it wasn't going to look like Miyamoto's latest Mario game or whatever. But you know, I think I one of the things I wrote about wrote a few extra credits episodes, and one of the things I wrote about was like,
Four about, I think.
yeah, four of them. As a hobbyist game developer, it's kind of like when your friends go to see you play like baseball in the amateur kind of weekend hobby. Like they know they're not expecting like professional performance, like, but it's cool because like, hey, got to run and like he's doing stuff and like you kind of encourage each other and you know you don't have to like either inflate their ego to be like, oh, this is the best thing I've ever seen, to just be like,
Yeah, yeah.
this is kind of cool.
There's this common tendency of friends actually not being honest when they're giving you feedback. Either they say it's the best thing in the world, or it's
Right, right. No, that's fair. Yeah, and I think that it was even less about like you know I wasn't looking for like a star rating from them so much as knowing that when I made something I'd have someone to show it to. It's like that's something that like in our online practice groups now still with Gamketo Club or my previously my college clubs. What a big part of the value was that every single week we were working on it, not just when we were finished, not just when we had something ready for the public. We could show people who kind of knew us, like, look at this cool thing I've been doing and the progress I've been making. And I know for a lot of people today, that's also where they like. You know, I'm not sure. It might be some of your habits too. Like either streaming development or like posting devlogs, etc. Make sure we feel like each thing we're doing, there's sort of a miniature kind of chance to demo that. And even just knowing we're going to be showing somebody else kind of helps us keep up on top of our own stuff of like, how do I have something new to show this week? How have I been doing things this
keeping
past
you
month?
comfortable with
Yeah, time can't
keeping the
just kind of
process going.
disappear. But so I
Yeah,
guess
absolutely.
I don't know if it might be a third trait in there. Um, I guess it really might just be being really, really in the same way we talk about, you know, my friends of like how much do they upgrade or downgrade or whatever. I was again, it's easiest when we're young to like. I was super not critical of like I didn't expect myself to do anything amazing. It might have helped that this was 20
Like
years
the
ago, so this is well
perspective.
before indie games were making a bunch of money. And so there wasn't any sort of expectation at all from anybody that this was going to be my job, that this was going to pay my income, that this was going to be my major in college. It was just like, you know, Sarah like does these things and John does those things and Chris makes games. And it was just like, okay, that's all it has to be. And like, that was cool and fine. And I didn't have to feel like it was supposed to be like, oh, but how is this going to be the next big thing? Or why is this going to push things across the top of the app store or whatever? I didn't care. I was like, I feel like making a space game. Make a space game now.
I think this is actually a pretty good point. So young people, they think they have a disadvantage because of their age and they're not taken too seriously. When in fact, they do have an advantage. Time itself, the most valuable resource.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I think. It depends how you see this thing, the perspective.
Agreed. Yeah, there's definitely advantages to either side. I remember when I started my first business trying to do training stuff. It was like I was probably 22, 23 years old, and like to be fair, like as a person trying to start a business, it did feel like I can't get my city people to kind of take me seriously. To parents of kids I might train, they're not really sure, like, this guy is not that old, what does he know? I've been doing it for a while by then, but they couldn't tell. And I do feel like in little ways it's kind of slightly easier now that like I'm in my 30s and like I kind of just like people just kind of assume
having a few projects behind you.
Yeah, I've got more projects I can point to. I've got more sort of former accolades or projects that do well commercially or jobs I held or whatever. But yeah, I mean, and certainly like it doesn't feel like my skills are vastly different. If anything, they're just kind of like more diversified. If I've seen more kinds of things. But like, I don't know. Yeah, there's pros and cons to it because the other bit was like, again, sort of a lower expectation, or maybe it's also an opportunity cost thing as to a lot of reason why I think a lot of adults have difficulty grappling into it is because they might be doing pretty solid in their career and they've got some pretty good income coming in from it. And it's like, well, I can't turn down this like promotional track I've been on in this field that's totally unrelated to try to do this thing versus like when you're kind of not pulling an income anyway because you're young or kind of early in the career where there's kind of lots of chances to kind of make some mistakes and still totally recover. There's no family being paid for, etc. Those things certainly get easier. And I think that maybe one of the downsides to that, of course, is that can reinforce that at least commercially, it can feel like this sort of young person's business in a way that I remember William Cheer, the Manifold Garden relativity guy, he was tweeting about like his fears that like he's the only reason to be able to make this amazing, awesome, epic in scale, distributed on Sony platforms indie game, which is I think not even out yet, but on sometime in the near future, is because he's like in his mid-20s, no mortgage, no family to pay for, like living very cheaply and so on, off of savings or whatever, in a way that like may not work later in his life. And he's kind of coming to terms with like, is that just the way that is? It has to be for what that is. And part of my dislike for that is why I often emphasize so much recreational, hobby scale game development. Where like, as long as we're not trying to make it feel like, oh, if it's not legitimate unless I'm doing it 40 hours a week, then people can have all these other things in their life. And just as they might, have a book they like to read or a meetup group about bicycling or whatever, they can fit game development in as long as their expectations are tempered and realistic about like what's going to happen in the time is not going to be Braid or, one of these kind of things. And that's fine. Still like worthwhile, still fun.
But what would you do if you just started like at 40 or 45 years old?
Sure. Yeah. So
and had those issues.
You're right. Well, and this is actually one of the things that I have figured out about the age thing. This is I taught some little children for the past school year every single Thursday at a kind of a bizarrely structured, unusual school. And what I figured out was like lots of the same questions and things that they got stuck on were really no different from when I was teaching graduate students. As like when I was a PhD student, had like grown adults in the classroom. If someone doesn't know something, they don't know something, and it doesn't matter if it's because like what age they're at, they don't know it. And so some of it depends on their technical fluency. The baseline question occasionally, and something that people take for granted, is there's sort of this assumption like they already know technical things in a way that just leaves a lot of people behind. It's like, okay, can they navigate a file system? Are they comfortable typing? Are they like semi-functionally fluent in recognizing file extensions? And this can sound so trivial to people who are already in this world of like throwing around acronyms and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's a huge barrier to people who just don't know that stuff. And so like literally that's why my courses, my angle, whatever has always been about like, all right, step one, we're writing a JavaScript game in Notepad. We're not installing an IDE. We're not configuring libraries. We're not trying to like set up a database. We're not running a server. We're typing text code and then seeing what that text code does, because that's kind of the start of everything. And like once you kind of get past that, and we can see like there's where I saved the file. Here's I opened it in the browser. And like, there's all these other topics of like compilation and object files and things we want to build a local native executable and the differences and optimizations and whatever. But I think first of all, I just try to get a focus on like, spatially what's going on, numerically how do we map the code logic to kind of what's going on with like when something goes left, when something goes right. The reason why I tend to structure these as rebuilding retro games is that they're so resource limited. At the time, of course, it was because the machines had no RAM and like garbage storage. But now it just means that like, okay, even if I'm not making any art, I can still put together this like really, really crude knockoff of an old Atari game and feel like I did a finished thing. And I use the kind of same analogy for like playing Mary Had a Little Lamb on a learning a recorder or something, or trying to, like, if you're cooking, the first thing you do is you follow a recipe. You're not trying to like invent it at the same time as you're.
I think game jams have the same result, like finishing a game as soon as possible and seeing the result.
Sort of, and in various ways, it's going to just emanate from me. Like, I'm mildly anti-jam in a way that like I appreciate that they get a lot of people into it. But I think some of the downsides are that the time structure. First of all, it's structured around creative outlet, and again in a way that I think oftentimes people are starting out. It's often better, at least some people I've trained, worked with, whatever, to start off with kind of some frankly unoriginal stuff with like maybe a little bit of a twist added to it. But with jams, partly because the projects are so small, they often wind up being more about like what's the hook, what's the idea, what's the gist, and it almost becomes like the game itself like isn't really often meant to be played so much as it's this thing to be talked about, this thing to be remarked upon, this thing to like, oh, how bizarre,
and to feel like you finished something actually.
But plausibly, some of the challenge I run into is when I used to, when I did a lot more of my private training as opposed to the group training, I had still an application process, and I'd ask people in that application process like, how many games have you made? And if people had made jams, they would discount it. They'd be like, well, I've made 4 things, but they're only jams, so it doesn't really count. And so, and they get this chip on the shoulder. Same thing that happened when I was we used to teach in grad school. Like our kind of academic structure uses a lot of processing. It's a kind of a spinoff of Java and kind of this isolated MIT sandboxed kind of practice environment. And even though its foundations are Java, and it does a few kind of things behind the hood to try to make things simpler, I had this problem where people would go through this programming course at a graduate level and then feel like, oh, but I didn't really do real programming because it was processing. And so I'm always looking out for like, how do I make sure that someone doesn't feel like they're using baby tools, doesn't feel like they're doing like, some sort of illegitimate version of the process where like, yeah, but it was a jam, so it doesn't count somehow. And like, obviously they're building perfectly legitimate. Like, stuff exists, it's done, they learned some things, they met some people. But I don't know. It's something that I've seen people come out of it where they discount the time. And I think one of the other things that troubles me about it is just that same sort of reason why, like, if someone's trying to learn a subject, a field, right, they have to continuously expose themselves to it and practice it and apply themselves to it.
Yeah, consistently.
It's the difference between like cramming for a test versus like studying all semester, where like even if you pass the test barely, it immediately all falls right back out.
There is a very fascinating law that says that the work expands to how much time you give to it.
Right.
I think it was called Pareto's principle. I'm not too sure about it.
Yeah,
but basically, that's the exact reason for why we end up doing the test or the homework one day before.
I mean, I remember there were times where like I would feel like, oh, good, I only got one worksheet today to do for homework or something, and I'd be in grade school, and suddenly it would still take the whole evening somehow, and it's because I would just kind of sit there fiddling on it. And I think that this is actually one of the things that obviously jams kind of get around by like avoiding the problem entirely of like, you got no time. You're immediately having to finish this as soon as you start your first drawing. As opposed to what I like about the longer term structured stuff, where we kind of spread it out, fit our lives around it, is it makes us have to kind of develop our own habits around setting our own kind of like week at a time deadlines or milestones, figuring out what's it going to look like when it's halfway done. And I think those are kind of more general planning skills useful for all kinds of stuff than kind of avoiding the subject. It's sort of like if someone does like a speed writing exercise, and obviously I do some speed coding demonstrations, so I'm not judging, but it's like, if the whole goal was like how can you write the best story in a minute? It's like, okay, that's kind of fun, but like also if you're going to try to write something so you want someone to read, then like edit it, like put it through some process, like structure your thinking, and all that gets lost if the whole objective is like, but what can you crank out? And it's again, all right, fine if it helps stir up some emotions, but then like take that and then do something with it. Take it further, build off that. Take the people you met that way and then build something longer. Just to kind of have a thread throughout your life that's not just like this 1 weekend a year where you just like crash and like no sleep, all Red Bull. Some people that can work for, a lot of people it's inaccessible to. I don't know. And I think the kind of last little asterisk next to those, like, might as well get my game jam ranting out of my system, is the way that it feels like also it has glorified kind of a crunch kind of attitude of like that being where things come from. And it's not like it's forced on people in the jam scenario, but it just, I don't know. I prefer to
I think that there's a message that is actually trying to be spread with those game jams. The main scope probably is in setting deadlines. Although there is this issue and people think that deadlines are actually bad, I think that they might actually be good.
Oh, yeah.
Like setting them for long term, finishing a game in 3 months or 1 month. Because if you don't set that time, you probably end up finishing it in 1 year or 2.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Or literally never. This is part of why with the club, like the current club is all but some true of my 2 college institution ones. When they pitch, they're declaring when this game's going to get released. And like, notwithstanding some sort of like actual family emergency, like that's when the game comes out. And it kind of gets us having to switch gears at a certain point of like, okay, well, how do we start tying up loose ends instead of creating more? Because otherwise what ends up happening is the thing just spreads out. And I've seen projects built in kind of semi-academic environments where it'd be like 6 years with no releasable thing, never played by anybody, never actually tackled any of the real problems they're kind of putting off of like, oh, no one feels like doing UI or no one feels like doing whatever. And they kind of just, those things never happen. And it's really tough because like for the people involved, they're not sure if what they learned from it is actually applicable to a project that finishes. They don't have any, I think a lot of our learning happens in hindsight of we kind of did something and finished it and then kind of wince at it about what we wish we would have done different and carry that forward. But it's hard while we're still inside that frame to see like, where did it lead us? Where did it get us? Where did it drop us off at? And so, yeah, I'm a huge fan of like deadlines and kind of sticking to them. And at the very least, to start getting it out there and get attention, get feedback, and then maybe come back, pivot, update, which obviously is an option these days.
Yeah, I mean, like you can get deadlines for like weekly deadlines, not just for releasing your game. To start promoting earlier.
Yep.
So that you get feedback before releasing.
Yeah.
So that before you actually get to the end of the project, so that you don't find at the end that the core concept is actually flawed.
Oh yeah, no, and I mean,
that's why playtesting is so important.
Yeah, and this is something that it also depends on what someone's purpose is, and this is something that obviously is the distinction as to like, are they trying to get traffic? Are they trying to get customers as opposed to if they're building the thing they want to build? People's attitudes vary. Some of it's kind of garage band mentality, like we're gonna play our music, and if people don't want to listen to it, whatever, it's our music. And that's fine. I like that. That's kind of my jams. But, it is different from someone trying to build a product and a business around it. Then, early testing is invaluable to, like, figure out, does anyone care? I made a note the other day on Twitter about, like, if something is, if it's, what is it? If people don't want it, they don't care how hard you worked on it. Like, it doesn't matter how beautiful it is. It doesn't matter if it's the most amazing thing in the world. I remember I was in some sort of store. It was like maybe the first points in time in my life when I could stand in the store and check a game review on my phone, standing in a store to decide to buy something. And I saw this like new tank game, and I looked up the reviews, and I was like, oh, it's got really good reviews. And I was like, but I just don't want a tank game. Like, it doesn't matter how good it is. I don't really feel like playing a tank game. And so that was it. Whereas on the other side, what'd you say? What'd you say?
There was no hook to get you into it.
Well, no, it's just that it just wasn't something like the topic, the feel. Like I felt like I had played enough games like it, whatever it was. Like it was like it didn't matter how great they did it. It didn't matter if it had like 100% ratings and 5 stars and whatever. I just didn't want what it was.
It was still a tank game.
Yeah, I just like was not in the mood. But on the other end of the spectrum, like if something really resonates with people, if they want it, if they're into what it is, they will go through like they'll deal with a ton of imperfections, flaws, inconveniences to go out of their way to like play this like fragment of a unrealized idea because it speaks to them, and that's just something sort of very different than the other thing. And so some people like polish obviously makes a big difference, but yeah, that's where early testing can help us figure out, or either early releasing prototype kind of phases. Is there an audience here? Is this resonating with people? And if it's not, then we can better reallocate maybe our energy and resources somewhere else.
This is also quite interesting because there are many games on the App Store, at least, which seem to be those generic ideas which still gather many downloads still.
Oh, yeah.
And they appeal to many people.
Totally. Well, and the App Store is also a super hyper bizarre space. I'd be reluctant to either extrapolate too much from the App Store or to assume that those things apply to a lot of other things. The volume of games released to the App Store is enormous.
Yeah,
and
thousands.
Literally like, God, I'm going to feel bad if we get this wrong. I think it's hundreds a day. I think it is several hundred per day.
500 or so?
Yeah, I think 500. That sounds right. I didn't want to get it wrong, but I think that sounds about right. And so the space is very complicated. But yeah, it's also like there's a difference between.
Does that also include the apps or just the games?
I think that's games, but it might be games on Android plus iOS for what it's
Oh,
worth.
I see.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But it depends on when you look at these numbers. Even those numbers that I last heard were like a couple years ago, they might be enormously worse now. But like the other thing about like the experiential space of like holding this thing in my hand and like I'm kind of standing in a line and well, what can I do with this? It's just a very different kind of thing than when someone's at a computer screen, when someone's on a game console, and they kind of like want to kind of go somewhere. They want to do something else for a little bit. They want their headspace to be kind of different. It's very different from like, you're right. If it's this, and like my wife plays a lot of solitaire on the phone. It's solitaire. There's nothing fancy about it. I think the game's literally called Solitaire. There's no spin.
Yeah,
There's
I
like
think the top ones have, many of them have 10 million downloads.
no.
1 million.
So again, so many of them. There's the danger
Many of
because
them,
a
oh.
tiny fraction of percentage of them have any downloads.
Yeah.
And they got all of them. It's very much a spike-driven business, and I think some people get the wrong idea that they'll look at like the top apps list and be like, well, they must be doing fine. Even out of I think there's some numbers from several years ago from the IGDA's collection of survey stuff. I think it was like even games in the top 1,000 list on the App Store that were not in the top 100 still were making like on average like maybe 11,
Not too much.
like 11K or 22K a year or something. Still like essentially grad student wages. Not city living expenses in the United States, etc. Like it's just sort of like not what it looks like. And again, that's even the games that like are on that top 1,000 list and hold that spot for a year, which is not a trivial thing. Yeah, App Store is kind of a bloody mess of a market space.
Yeah, it's getting more and more crowded.
Yeah. It very much more the way kind of a lot of stuff's been going, and this is the same thing. It works. The same thing's true for Steam. Same thing's true for console games, etc. Is audience building. It's the same sort of thing you would do if you're trying to sell a book of like, okay, well, who's on my mailing list? Who have I run into? Who's met me at conferences or whatever? Who's seen my stuff? Who's signed up with us? Who's been to our pressers or read articles, reviews, or whatever? But it's like growing that audience and then being able to like serve that audience more directly is kind of what publishers used to do. Publishers now play a very different kind of role in the machinery. But like one reason why one publisher is different from another is that like they sell to strategy game fans, they sell to action game fans. And when it's a developer to a consumer relationship as like the web enables, it can be so much more niche of like, they're into like really kind of like tricky, quaint FPS games with like a narrator that does tricky things. And like Beginner's Guide was great. It very much satisfied me after Stanley's Parable. Like that's the niche that I'm in right now. And that's what I'm going to get from those people,
Absolutely. Yeah. Shall we go to the next question?
Sure, totally.
All right. Let's see. Tips for being the first time to a game dev conference.
Game Dev conference?
Like you are interested in going to one?
Oh,
like
sure.
The International Game Dev Conference?
Totally. Yeah. Okay, good. So for context, I've been to about a dozen GDCs. I helped run IndieCade for the past 4 or 5 years. I've been to IndieCade Europe. So I've got some sampling to work from. It partly depends on what kind of conference it is. Some conferences,
GDC,
which what'd you say?
Being the first time at GDC.
Okay, yeah, sure. So first time at GDC. So first thing to do is to not pay for one of the more expensive passes. They've got passes that are like $1,000 plus or whatever.
I saw the prices.
What those are really designed for is, okay, let's say I'm Electronic Arts, Activision, Ubisoft, whatever, and I feel like sending somebody on the company's dime. That's when those passes get bought. Don't buy those passes out of like wallet money, personal funds. Like that's, and the other part is that, and the reason for that is because like what they really give you that the other passes don't is they give you like, you can go to the actual talks and whatever. But like, you're not paying money to be at a networking.
Get featured a few years later on the channel.
Yeah, A, the same talks are on the channel, but like B, like you don't pay to go to a networking conference to like sit in a room like not talking to people around you. What I've literally done is sometimes what the most valuable part of those talks is actually the same sort of value that I think part of what universities accomplish is part of their value is like a university, like when they have a chemical engineering program, it's getting people from around the world who care about chemical engineering early in their careers to come together and talk to each other. And you can do that by like, I literally will just like, okay, I'll go to GDC on my cheaper pass, which is still like the cheapest 5-day pass I can get. It's either
what option do you go for?
I used to do tutorials pass, which meant like Monday, Tuesday plus the 3-day expo. Now I did educators pass for a couple years when I was still at grad school. Now I tend to do indie game pass, which basically the cheapest pass again gets me there 5 days behind the doors. But then I'll check the schedule and I'll literally kind of like attendee snipe. I'll be like, okay, well, I want to talk to the kind of people who are currently having this discussion. I will go, like, when the talk ends, be outside that door, and then one or two things. One, either, like, wander in there and talk to the speakers afterwards, because then just kind of stop caring when the door's open, or just...
And stay in the first row
or
and
just, or I mean, so
answering
again,
and
like
asking
when
questions.
when it's over, when the talk's over, because I wasn't in the talk, just going in there and just like talk, because like they're kind of all cycling out the speakers, whatever, or literally too, just when people were walking out, not even the speakers, the attendees who like also cared about the subject I care about, merge into that crowd, start chatting with them, grab lunch together, like that's networking. And it didn't involve
Yeah.
me having to spend that like 60-minute block sitting in a room quietly with my notepad, which is like, I don't know. If I'm there as a speaker, like I'll do that occasionally, but like the yield, the value is just not that great compared to like talking to people, sitting down at tables, meeting people, exchanging cards with people, that kind of
Is
thing.
there any particular path that gets you the most value for the money, like in terms of networking?
Again, I basically look at what's the cheapest pass there that's 5 days, which is either going to be IGS, Educator's Pass, or Tutorials Pass. I think Tutorials Pass used to be like 500, now it's like 800. Indie Game Pass and Educator's Pass closer to 300.
If you
Indie
get
Game
them
Pass,
like a few months before, you have a cheaper price.
yeah. There's like an early bird discount or something. I think as much as obviously people try to avoid paying the more close to time period rates. The other thing that can sometimes work, so like I've often been there as a speaker, which is great because then it's literally like part of they don't pay you, but they do give you like the high end go anywhere pass because that's how they kind of compensate you. And so like the easiest way to do that, like yeah, you can submit talks and you should, but also just like lots of people I know, including myself, occasionally just find our way onto a panel where like someone else had like got their thing submitted, but they kind of need like another few people to talk about whatever. And if you've been networking proactively and they know that you're kind of a go-to person who can talk about subject X, Y, or Z, they might tap you on the shoulder, free pass. And not only that, but like 5 or 10 minutes of talking, which is like not a bad deal for just like, then I'll just pay for like my travel and hotel or whatever. But yeah, I think the important part of, I think people get the mistaken idea, the value there is what's on the stage. My first GDC I went to, and I was
The connections are the value, actually.
What'd you say?
The connections that you made.
Yeah, the people
are the
there,
value.
absolutely. My first GDC, I went to some sort of talk about business stuff, and Dave Perry of Shiny, MDK, Messiah, that guy, he was giving a talk, and it was like during the tutorials period, so we kind of all day with him and some other people. And over lunch, they used to bring out kind of this like semi-catered lunch on the first 2 days. I was like, hey, is anybody sitting with you? Do you mind if I do? And he's like, sure. So I'm like in my early 20s, hanging out chatting with David Perry about stuff. And what I realized was like his knowledge and his thoughts were about like Super Nintendo era games, and kind of like he'd already kind of retired a little bit and sold his company. And like he's obviously a smart person, a helpful person, a genuine, there's no criticism to him. But I was like, what I really need to be meeting and finding is who's going to be on that stage in 10 years. Like, I'm not here to ask who was doing important stuff 10 years ago. I need to meet who's going to be doing stuff 10 years from now. And sure enough, like that's most of my valuable networking I've done in my life, that I now have connections that are high up in various kind of companies, are people who, when I met them, they were entry level, they were beginners, they were students, they had no idea what they're doing, they were CAs at the conferences, whatever. But
And
like,
they kept being your connections to this day.
yeah, just staying in touch with people, staying friends with them, and this is part of the value of like doing the more affordable passes. Because like if someone does a higher cost pass, then they're gonna like maybe go once every few years or something. But by doing those lower cost passes, I can kind of go almost every year, even if I'm not speaking, and kind of keep a thread, keep my kind of stay in the crowd, catch up with people, see how they're doing. The other thing that's helped that is actually this exact same sort of thing here, where I think I had been, so like I took some years off from industry stuff, went to grad school, came back out, was doing my online teaching, independent stuff. And then to stay in touch with people, part of like the benefit of my podcast I run, or like when I have guest speakers on my YouTube channel, whatever, is it gives me this reason to kind of dig back through my old contacts and be like, where's that person who was my mentor at my first job? And like they've gone into a few companies since, whatever, but now like they're guest speaking at my club, or they're guest speaking on the podcast or whatever. And it's a chance to kind of like simultaneously catch up with them, catch them up on what I'm up to, keep connected. And it's one more sort of reminder ping that like when they have someone else that they know who's got a question, they at least know who I am and what I'm up to. And if that's a good fit, they feel in touch and they can continue a thread in Facebook that's not from like 11 years ago, but like a couple months ago. So yeah, that's like these sort of chats are often like they help the audience, but they also can help kind of reinvigorate or refresh those connections.
Still on topic of conferences and
Sure.
connections, do you think it's more valuable to make many connections but not as deep, or fewer, way fewer, but
yeah,
really getting detailed?
so there, I think there's I think it depends on how long someone's been going to conferences and what sort of access they have because of that. And so I think there was some sort of discussion articles, Twitter feed, whatever it was from a while back, of someone who'd been to a whole bunch of conferences saying that to him, he looks for just forming a few really valuable connections. I think that works for him because everyone already knows who he is. And that allows him to have access to like make and find some pretty important people in a given event. When I was a beginner and running around, like I would just meet everybody I could. I didn't know who was going to stick with me, who was going to resonate, who would even come back the next year. One of the people I hung out with my first or second year is actually the head of wargaming.net. He's now like probably a billionaire from World of Tanks. At the time, his company was trying to do this like really like hex game, kind of like a little more, like it was niche. Like it had an audience, it had customers, but it was just a very different product than what World of Tanks has become. But like I didn't know at the time, he didn't know at the time. We were just people running around. And so basically what happened is every time I'd go to lunch, every time I'd go out for the evening, it was trying to scoop up as many people as we could to kind of catamari together and be like, who else wants to go to lunch with us? Who wants to go grab dinner with us? Who wants to go hang out at the park with us? And like the bigger that crowd gets, the less awkward it gets for everyone there. It increases the chance that there's some sort of relevant overlap or connection as to like in that circle of people. If there's someone talking to you about audio and talking your ear off and you're like, look, I got no disrespect, but I'm not an audio person. I don't need one. But you're like, you know what? Jess over here does audio. You two should talk to each other. And then I can more easily talk to somebody else. Helps everybody. But that comes from, at first, just sort of very much scattershot of trying to meet people. Now, obviously, it's still not like sort of a competition to like see how many names I can get in my book or something. But I do take a philosophy of like, I bring, let me see here. I got like 2 boxes of cards just printed. A little bit in advance. This one's still sealed. There we go. So lots of cards printed. And the reason why is you don't ever want to like be in a situation where you're holding back cards from like, oh, I only have like 12 with me today. So in case I meet someone important, I gotta have that card. You want to be able to freely like, you know, you meet someone who doesn't seem like you have a relevant connection, hand them a card, leave them a card. Because
you can probably nowadays connect with them through social media instantly on the spot.
Sort of. I tend to like sometimes people will do it. I find that those are harder for me because like with my cards, part of what's nice about the cards is like it says like literally, I mean in my case, you know, someone sees this and they're like, oh yeah, it was on his jacket, it was on his bag, it was on his phone, that's his Twitter icon, that's that guy, I remember him. And like it says on like what role are they in, how do I contact them, versus like a social media connection. If it's Facebook, it's kind of half personal stuff. I can't really easily tell on there.
That you have the phone with you wherever you go, like even in the bathroom.
Yeah,
wherever you go, you always have it with you, so that's why. The card, you can always throw it.
Sure, but again, the difference though is that I literally have, so and again, maybe it's this problem of like privileged situation. I have 5,000 Facebook friends. Like that's the cap. I've occasionally shaved some off of there to like replenish some more, but going to a lot of conferences, like you accumulate people and they get lost in the faces. Whereas like I literally have stacks of cards of like people I've set aside to be like, contact these people for the podcast. Or like contact these people with like potential speakers, or contact these people to be like. The
thing with cards is that if they don't take action instantly, they might forget about it if they let it aside. Maybe they put it somewhere else.
So this is what I find nicer about non-digital things. Here, like this guy, met him at IndieCade a couple years ago. He just did 5 character sprites for a game we just released. Like cards, because they're physical, like they bug you. They're on your desk. They're in your way. They're like. You put it somewhere and like it doesn't move itself. If it's digital, I can never look at it again because it's infinitesimally small. It doesn't exist unless I go looking for it. And again, this is what happens where like people get lost in my Facebook pile. People get lost in Twitter followers. Like I don't know how many I'm following. I kind of don't look that close at my feed anymore because it's too many, and I'm not really like paying close attention to that as a source of information each day. I might check my notifications or whatever. But I mean, yeah, I don't know. I find card, maybe it's also a generational thing. Maybe they're going out of fashion. I still think that they are helpful for keeping track of who was that person when I'm trying to find them. And obviously too, like at the conference especially, it's useful to like have in my pocket to be like, who was that person I ran into earlier today? And if it's like a connection off Facebook or social media or whatever, it's harder for me to kind of filter through that and figure out like, did they add me? Did they whatever? Sometimes it can also be useful. What other thing I'll do is like I intentionally keep the back of my cards writable. It's mostly white space because oftentimes I know when someone hands me a card, like I want to write down on there something about like a note about where we ate, what we were talking about, what we're doing, whatever. So if I send them a LinkedIn request after the conference or that maybe even later the evening based on the card, whatever, I can mention that in the message and they're like, oh yeah, that's that guy. We were talking about prototyping or whatever. And it just feels more. Go ahead.
I think it depends on what your actual goal is. If you want to actually reach out to those people after a conference, then you can always take like a software like Evernote and take the notes in there, like who you contacted, who you talked with, the names, a list of the names, and then you can reach out to them.
Sure. And at a previous speaker training event, I kept a Trello stack of people of notes about what I interacted with each person. Still, people who had a card, we traded cards. It's also part of the sort of professional dance that happens. And people who do not have cards seem like they are unprepared, or seem like they don't take themselves seriously, or seem like they don't have an identity established yet. And
I'm not sure where I heard this, that they become less relevant by the second. I heard somewhere.
I mean, so maybe one thing that could reflect is that people change jobs and that kind of stuff pretty often. And that's also why no matter where, when I worked at EA, I still had a card of my own. When I worked at Zip Zap Play, still had a card of my own. When I worked at Worldwide Stupid Fun Club, still had a card of my own. Georgia Tech teaching, still had a card of my own. I always print my own cards because, like, I'm not my employer. I'm not their brand. I'm not those people. I have my own history, my own projects, my own background, my own angle, whatever. And so, like, I prefer to always have those with, like, what's my URL with my portfolio to my information to my story to whatever. And those don't go obsolete nearly as rapidly. Those are still true even if I switch present source of income, employer, change line of business, whatever. It's still me. So I find it valuable. That's going to be way easier than it used to be in terms of literally now sites will fulfill and order 500 of those, like, free for the first order or heavily discounted for, you know, special embossed printing or whatever. So I think it's hugely advantageous to get personal cards made rather than company ones. Because I do agree that, like, some of the ones that have the company cards, people are crossing out the thing and they try to write their personal email address, and it's kind of just a mess of, like, if I'm not writing to them for Activision business or whatever, I'd rather just be able to reach that human being. You know. But I don't know. Again, might be a generational thing. Might be going away. Maybe now when I hand it to someone that they might think I'm kind of a dinosaur because they're like, oh, paper, like some sort of cave person.
Not necessarily. It's going to become easier to be digital. That's the
yeah. Well, and the other thing that has been nice about that is that when someone is like low on cards and they have one card left, the answer is just take a picture with your phone, and then like solved it, and like you're fine kind of until you can get back to your bag, box, whatever, Kinko's, and you can still kind of like just make sure, get my info. There, solved it.
Now, there's one video of yours that particularly resonated with me on a deeper level, let's say. The one with "no one sees your worst work anyway."
Yes.
I love that one the most.
Good. I'm glad.
As a creator especially, like making games and just going about making them, not worrying about what others think of what you're making.
Yeah.
Just doing your best.
Yeah. And I think what I like about it is it allows us to like kind of do our own thing for our own purpose. I think sometimes we get caught up in there's a lot of my reading stuff is stoicism, and Marcus Aurelius got this line about like we tend to like we tend to assume like that we know better than others or respect our opinion higher than others or whatever, and yet that's not reflecting like how concerned we are about other people's opinions of our stuff and ourselves.
And because we know better, do you think that's the thing that actually puts pressure on us? To be the ones that know?
It might be. I mean, I do. I like there's the Ira Glass quote about the taste that we have that gets us into it, makes it hard for us to deal with some of our first work. We see the flaws in it. We're uncomfortable with it. We're not satisfied with it. That's what keeps us growing. It's just like some of the best artists that I know are very critical of their own artwork or photography or whatever, and that's part of why it's as good as it is. They're not someone who just like kind of dashes it off and is like, it's great. Brilliant, I'm a genius, take it or leave it. That might be part of it, but it really, I think people get lost when they get too worried too early on about trying to satisfy the opinions of strangers, especially, and this is again part of why like I think it helped me that I was like my neighbor, my fourth grade best friend, my whatever, like my audience of like I knew them, I respected their tastes, I knew we kind of had like a kind of certain cultural vibe about us of what kind of things we were into and like to play together. And that's very different from any given time you get a huge crowd of strangers. Part of what happens too is that people outside of marketing world will often assume that like people are people. Views are views, followers are followers, reach is reach, ad impressions are ad impressions. And like it couldn't be further from the truth. People are vastly different.
So that's why it's better to first show your game to people close to you before you go to reach out to strangers?
There's a few layers. Part of it's also friends and family tend to be more forgiving of errors, tend to be more likely to keep things secretive if you're like... and I think some of the secretive stuff... there used to be this impression that people would have that like secretive stuff about like, oh, the project's under wraps or public or, you know, NDA, whatever. They think it's because like they think they have the gold nugget that they're trying to hide. The reality is most of that stuff, what it's for is for hiding totally embarrassing disasters. It's like... this might get canceled entirely, and we don't want people getting excited about it because we do not know what the hell we're doing. And like that's most of what's going on with secrecy behind companies and NDAs, etc. Is like we are too embarrassed right now with the state of it and don't want anyone to know what an S it is. Sign this first. then you can see what an embarrassment it is while we're trying to fix it, improve it, test it, see if we're going to relaunch it, whatever.
Yeah, and this is actually a common trend in Kickstarter. Like projects do get funded, overfunded actually, but they don't end up being made.
Oh yeah. Well, and Kickstarter's got a handful of challenges. For one thing, and this again comes down to this, like the audience, like who the people are matters. Part of what Kickstarter has tried to replace, and I think positively so because it needs more competition, is people trying to like find some sort of source of funding, some sort of investor, some sort of publisher, whatever. And the thing about that is that was not just an ATM. It wasn't just the person who had cash. It was always somebody. The whole point of that interaction was because they either care about that industry, know about that industry, have done their work in the industry, etc., and can offer advice and input from their perspective of like the same sort of thing like talk about like, like I said earlier, publishers, certain ones like no strategy game players, and like that's their base, that's their reach, that's every game they've ever shipped. And so consequently they give valuable feedback as to like, oh, don't do things this way. Like that people don't like that anymore. Or like, this is good. I like the way you're going about it, but here's how to convey that better in a way that's going to respond with them. In a way that if your money is coming from a bunch of people who are consumers, they don't have that perspective on things. They don't have that angle on, like they know what they like, but they unfortunately have the same sort of difficulty of a lot of beginning artists, which is to say they don't know what they want, but they'll know it when they see it. And that's not nearly as useful of feedback because it's basically just pushing the plate back. And that's not how you can like learn to be a better cook from just someone being like, no.
Yeah, right. So as a creator, you like many times try to share your work and ask for feedback, but it's only like very rarely when actually people give you feedback, valuable feedback.
And part of that, one reason for that is because teaching is a job. Like giving actual feedback is something that like someone needs to like have practice doing, know how to deliver effectively, takes effort, consideration from their part. And legitimately, like, part of why when students pay a school to go there is because they're paying someone to look at work that is not good enough that they would pay them to look at it. Like that's what that is. When it's like, hey, I'm paying an English professor to read my writing because my writing is not good enough for the English professor to pay me to read it. Now, once they become a published writer in the New York Times or whatever, someone's paying a subscription fee because they're like, I so much want to read what's in this book or in this article that I will pay money that direction. And a beginner who's looking for feedback is often in that situation of like so many things are wrong with it in a way that like it takes someone kind of like focused attention to really kind of prioritize, okay, well, what's the first thing we're going to look at? What's going to be constructive? How can we talk through that? What some directions we might explore? And it's like, it's tough at that level to give really constructive feedback. Another example I use for this is kind of also the...
so that's why you should hire experts to test your game?
So I don't necessarily know about that. I wouldn't necessarily encourage either like paying an expert to test the game because one of the points has to do with that. I try to use a million other metaphors because I think people know lots of other industries and skills more closely than game development. But like with piano, just as an instrument that is pretty commonly, people play it, people know about it, get piano lessons, whatever.
Yeah, what I do.
Oh, you do? Okay, well, sweet. So like when someone goes to like, if we picture like someone's kid's piano lesson, someone's totally a beginner at it, they've been doing it for a little while, whatever, like, there are usually so many things wrong with someone's like first piano recital. You can't really constructively like give corrective feedback beyond like, you're on a good track, keep doing it, keep practicing. Haven't been doing this long enough yet. Like
8th place trophy.
Right, and again like it's a better trophy than somebody who wasn't doing it at all. But it's not like the feedback really comes down to like there's just so many things they're gonna have to clean up on their own as they do it more. And the answer really is like keep doing it. You'll figure it out, but you're not there yet. And there's so many things wrong. Yeah.
There's a problem with that because it actually encourages you to think that you're actually a winner when you actually get the 8th place.
I don't know. I think people kind of contextualize these things. I mean, like when I got some little science fair awards when I was in high school or whatever, but I was also like, but it's science fair. Like this isn't like this isn't real. I'm in junior division. Like, I didn't cure anything. Like people know this stuff. Like I think there was the concern. I remember I like the arguing back and forth, the bickering online about like, millennials got too many participation trophies, and it's like the people writing those articles who were mad about it gave them those participation trophies. Like that's kind of messed up. I don't know. Like I say, I think there's good intentions on both sides. I think it's a very case by case specific situation for somebody. Depends on their age, depends on the circumstances, depends on the pressures that they're under, depends on what the priorities are. And this is also something that, again, comes down partly to what someone wants out of it. If what they want is that they want to be making games, they want to make games their way, they want to make games they feel like making. That's very different from I want to start a business that delivers a product to customers that they'll buy. And come hell or high water, I don't care if it's a match 3 clone, I don't care if it's a reskinned version of Solitaire, I don't care if it's whatever it might be. And like those are fine. Like there's nothing wrong with that. But that's a very different operation to run than like I have these creative ideas and things I just want to run with and flourish with, and that's fine. In the same way as part of what I liked about Bob Ross and what he did was like he would talk about just like, let's paint because you want to paint, and now you have a painting, and we're done. And that's not the same sort of thing as like when I go to Walmart and I buy a poster of like some graphic artist was paid probably terribly little to produce some commissioned art to put on this poster to sell. Like that's a productized thing which exists in a space and is in people's houses and is fine. I bought posters behind me, no judgment here. But that's different from the like creative outlet of like I'm crafting, I'm expressing my ideas, I'm exploring my identity, I'm figuring out who I am, finding my voice. It's just very different from like that other market side stuff.
Self-awareness.
Yeah.
What I think though is that we just keep coming back to expectations, because people want to make the games that they want to make, but at the same time after they make it, they expect to make money with it.
Well, yeah, and I agree. Expectations, especially expectations disconnect, is a huge problem. And this is part of why I try to encourage that if what someone's aiming for is to just build their games their way for fun, for expression, try it out, whatever, then to not sink heavy investment into it, expecting to see it back at a return. Because what gets dangerous is when they're counting on, oh, this will all be worth it when I get to the end of it. And that's when they start spending more money on assets, and they start spending more money on marketing, and start spending money on all kinds of things where, again, like, to a degree, especially if it's their first, second, third project, like my one of my most commercially successful projects was probably my 55th game. Or 52nd or something out of my order of projects.
There's a common trend of a game becoming successful if it's the 15, I mean.
Oh, you say 15?
No, 50, actually.
50, oh yeah.
As successful as the 50 game.
Yeah, but like, but again, it like depends on what we also mean by successful. Because before I had a project that was like commercially successful, backed by a publisher, reached millions of players, whatever, I had games that were freeware that were played by like 30,000 people. And like, that wasn't bad. It was downloadable, which is harder than a play in browser game. But like, basically it was looking at what were success metrics prior to commercial success metric. And the same sort of thing also people look for when like trying to get awards validation. A lot of people, and so like say I'm involved with Indicate, I'm not involved with the curation, judgment, that side of selection to festival entries or whatever. I just do speakers organizing. But like, some people get the mistaken impression that when there's a game at a festival, which this is actually an Indicate shirt from this year, Indicate or GDC finalist or whatever, that they're loaded, or that they've made it, or that they're doing great or whatever. That's almost always another stepping stone, kind of like when I was like, oh, I had a freeware game played by 30,000 people. Like, they're going to try to take that award ticket, try to wave it around and be like, please someone help fund the next phase of our development, or like, let's try to get some press off of this, because they're still trying to like make their thing work in a way that people assume they're past that line, but they are still in that direction in many cases, if that's what their priority is. Those are additional kind of like milestones along the way, not like rewards after the fact for like, oh, they're loaded forever. There's also cases where like, we talk about these bigger games, older games, way industry used to work, is like, I think it was Chris Taylor, Gas Powered Games, had a failed Kickstarter, and he was this really great heartfelt talk, and like a chat kind of like this one, but he was talking about how like his games, people knew them for like 10, 20 years. They'd buy all their games. They would assume like this company's doing great from all the titles get good ratings, top of the magazines, top of sales charts, whatever. But like the way the businesses tend to be structured was like the publisher was eating a lot of those gains as part of the trade-off for the developer being sure that if this game failed, they wouldn't be shutting off their lights and going out of business. And so they consequently kind of went the company-sized version of paycheck to paycheck of each time. Now we've got to kind of go figure out and find what's our next deal we can land of someone else who's got more capital to kind of keep us afloat while we ship the next product. And, you know, it worked. It functioned. It paid salaries. It got people jobs. It made products people liked. But, like, there was that layer of risk absorption, which the publisher layer is frankly there to do, and that, like, even games that they assumed did enormously well, like, the people on them weren't, like, set forever. The company wasn't set forever. It was still, like, what's our next project? How are we going to do that one? Starting from kind of square one, plus reputation they've accumulated.
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, this is so value-packed already. I think I'm going to rewatch it after it's done.
Sure.
A few times. There's so much value to get out of this. Absolutely, while actually working on the game. Okay, let's go to the next question. All right. The biggest obstacle that you had at first, excluding the fact that languages were a bit less intuitive or harder.
Yeah. Let's see. Biggest problem at first. Biggest problem at first was not having any peers to pace myself off of. And I think that this is a lot of what I've tried to address. I keep trying to fix other people's problems that I had with my clubs, is like being able to pace yourself off of a sense of like, what should games look like at my experience level? What can this look like for the amount of time I'm able to invest in it? What does a $0 budget freeware game look like? Because part of what happens, and people laugh about it all the time, as to like, you know, someone gets new into games, they're totally just kind of out there like, okay, well, it's Call of Duty, but it's got these other features added, and it's like Drake's Fortune, except it's like Skyrim size, and whatever they're doing. Like, obviously, those are $85 million projects, $200 million projects. Like, it's a 6-year game built by 200 veterans. Like, it's kind of absurd. But like, that's the reference frame they have. And so like when I went and gave a talk at Job Corps here in LA about like, you know, game development, whatever, and I talked, you know, I spent a little bit of time on like Medal of Honor Airborne team, so I've seen some like Call of Duty-esque scale, that kind of production. But like, that's such a small sliver of what game development has been in my life, or the games I've made, or the games I've A, most liked doing, or B, feel the most ownership over. I mean, when they're one of like hundreds of people, you're like, okay, I did the thing that in some meeting turned to some other thing that someone eventually changed that code and it resulted in this UI thing in the corner, and then there was like the flashing light in the plane. Like, it's hard to like claim ownership over that versus like, this game was my idea. I made the characters. I made the mechanics. Here's what I changed about it along the way. Is usually true for projects that are like way smaller in scale, where it can be a handful of people, a few people, one person, whatever. But that all begins from having peers to pace yourself off of. And I think part of the value of, kind of incidental value of institutions like schools, university systems, whatever, is that people have like, okay, we're in 11th grade. That's who I'm competing against. And universities like, okay, we're undergrads. Here's who we're competing against intellectually, in life experience, and whatever. In a way that otherwise, like, it hits them hard when they go from being like upperclassmen to then like upperclassmen to then like literally everyone in their entire career lifespan. And I feel this resonates with me too about when people gripe about the 30 under 30 stuff, which I was on one of those lists some years ago.
Forbes.
Yeah, the Forbes one. And what happens is like people get the wrong impression that that's about like, oh, if you don't do it by your 30, then like you're cooked, like, you know, miss your chance. It's also junior league. It's like high school science fair. It's because if you took away the cap of 30 and tried to compare anybody on the 30 under 30 list to like the career accomplishments of people in their 40s and 50s and beyond, like,
I mean, people are doing it even at 80s. Like,
sure, yeah, absolutely. Like, it's not an endpoint. It's just like it's more of like a novelty of we talked about like kind of piano playing. There's like this kind of prodigy of like, ooh, look, someone's 11 and they're playing piano or whatever. It's like kind of quaint. It's like a lot of, and this is not at all to downplay like the accomplishment people on the list. They're going out of the way to find like people who are doing impressive things, people in that age range. But I would go to these meetups of other people on those lists, and for the most part, it's like, you know, like myself, like entrepreneur, some other people like small business people like own some real estate, whatever. But it's things that if we were not under 30 would not have impressed anybody. They'd be like, yeah, human beings start businesses. That's where every business comes from. Like, a lot of them are enormous. Yours isn't. And you're like, all right, well, that's fine. You know, it's this thing that part of what happens is when people don't have peers to contextualize themselves off of, like I did when I was growing up, because I didn't know anybody else making games. Internet was in terrible condition at the time. I didn't like have just peer, not only to not make games with, but to just look across the table and see what they're doing, what I'm doing. So what happens now is someone gets into making games and all they've seen are commercially successful stuff. They've seen Minecraft, they've seen stuff at the top of the store, they've seen stuff that ships with operating systems, they've seen things that were sold consoles to them throughout their childhood, and then they're trying to make games. And this is part of why I also try to contextualize things back to like, let's start with the 70s kind of projects, because those were made by one person in a lot of cases. Like that was, like Adventure was Warren Robnett. That was it. Because if you put a graphic illustrator on the project, they'd have nothing to do because you got like such terrible resolution. That was it. And it allows them to kind of incrementally build off that. I'm reminded too, there's sort of this impression that there's this old quote, it's also one of this using extra credits episode. The line that like Warren Spector was quoted by IGN kind of tongue in cheek of saying like, people get the wrong idea that like a game is all made by one person. Says Warren Spector, comma, creator of Deus Ex and Thief. Which again is kind of the joke because it was like a whole studio built those games. And I think when we were younger, we see the celebrity creators and we assume it's all one person projects. And even in like the indie kind of teams, with a handful of very rare exceptions, it's usually like the one person you've heard of, someone kind of a little more behind the scenes, maybe 3 or 4 other contractors on the art side and audio, maybe someone else who's kind of outside working with some business stuff. And like very quickly, it's like, that's a studio. Like it really would be like comparing the amount of, you know, weight one human being can carry to like the weight that 10 human beings can carry. It's more. And people get these very unrealistic ideas of what they should be able to do alone because they feel like they, you know, well, Miyamoto did it. He did not. He did not. He had a huge company of human beings supporting him around him while he was like creating character illustrations and other stuff. And it's not all of us to, again, downplay him or anything he's done, but it is to recognize how many more pieces there are in that process, in those meetings and in those discussions and at every layer of distribution and marketing and product decisions and whatever to make commercially scale games, which are just going to be very different mechanics than when it's like, I have an idea I want to make. I'm going to do it now. It's going to be different.
And I think,
Sure,
and
totally.
I think because of that last video that you made yesterday, one about, that one that did pretty well. Yeah, loved it.
Thank you.
With my perspective. So I think that's the thing that you can do to combat this obstacle. The most important, to put things into perspective.
Yeah.
To see what you actually should, how you should think about this.
And this is also a big part of why for my podcast, for Game Keto Community, most of my interviews and this is not to disrespect or discredit anybody involved in the interviews and stuff, but like I go out of my way to like I have connections and friends who are very high profile game developers. I'm not interviewing them. They're interviewed elsewhere. They're in magazines, they're on video, they're in channels promoted by their giant companies they work in, whatever. I'm mostly interviewing like behind the scenes people who are like hobbyists, people who are beginners, people who are middle phases of their career, people who filled roles no one's ever heard of. Because like for the vast majority of people making games, that's what it looks like. Like there are like 5 human beings in the world we can name on one hand who like Kojima, Miyamoto, Will Wright, Sid Meier, whatever, Warren Spector. I'm sure I can come up with more, but you get the idea. As compared to like everybody else, like you're either doing a much smaller project people are maybe not getting as much visibility on, or you're kind of like playing some piece in a bigger bit of machinery, which is fulfilling in its own different way. But like I met this person that was was up in Montreal for a games academic history conference, whatever. I met this woman developer from Ubisoft, and she was trying to figure out like why I would have left the thing at EA to have gone back into making like smaller games. And again, it was like no disrespect, but like the piece she plays in the Assassin's Creed series is just like not the same level of ownership as I like to have over smaller projects. Like I like to be one of the 4 people who have to come to the same page to make a thing. And that what comes with that too is this freedom to like totally screw up, totally try weird stuff, totally experiment, totally whatever, in a way that like any given one of those games to do anything.
I think you value money more than actually making the games that you want.
I mean, it's possible. Now, the other thing, and again, this is not to it could be a life choice for any given person. Like a lot of the skills people have in the game industry, programmers, UI designers, artists, project managers, whatever, they can often take those exact same skills and make more money more consistently with a more stable career in almost any other field. Like, they're almost all taking a bit of a pay hit, not like in order to do something that they enjoy more, they enjoy going to work more, they have more fun at the office, they have Nerf battles on Friday, it's a little more laid back, they can sometimes have beer in the office or whatever, but like they choose to like, that's something that they're comfortable making a trade-off with for being in a more volatile, higher risk industry. It's not, I'm not trying to justify any decisions managers do or don't do, but it's also the reality of like, it's a much more volatile industry of like every few years, companies that seemed bulletproof vanish from the market has shifted to like, now it's free to play, now it's microtransactions, now it's subscription based, now it's casual, now it's, sorry, now we're doing this other thing, hope your game's made out of cardboard because that's the future. And like whatever it is, leaves behind like behemoths who felt so solid that there's a muscle memory established that doesn't hang on, versus if they take those same skills and like stick them in like Microsoft corporate division or like IBM or like working at Apple or again any other thing that's in business software, etc., like they're less worried about like, not only will I still have a job here in 5 years, which that's its own question, it's so much turnover between one project and the next in the game industry, but like, will this company even be here in a few years? It's just this like,
I mean, like now since we're living in a very fast-paced society, I feel like what worked yesterday might not work today.
Absolutely. You know, this is a huge problem, especially for indies, where they'll have discussions based on like what worked, like, oh, this GDC talk from last year. And it's like, that may well be irrelevant. That may not at all be in touch with anything. There's usually sort of threads we can kind of deduce from it, but you have to contextualize everything. It's sort of like if someone, you know, when I did my pinball research, I'd be like, okay, well, the first pinball machine sold for like $16 in like 1931 or whatever, which is like $250 modern day. Got to contextualize it based on history of like, well, but money didn't mean then what it means now. And like that happens now like on an annual basis as to like that advice from last year is cooked. And what's worse is that things like, and again, it's not blaming anybody in it, they all do great stuff and good whatever. But like I gotta disclaim everything because everything I say can always sound like I'm trashing on somebody. But part of it, part of the freedom I enjoy of working like I'm my own company and whatever is like I never have to worry about these disclaimers of like, oh, I don't speak for my employer. Like I do, I'm my employer, so I can just say stuff. But like Indie Game, the movie, part of the danger that it has wrought is that it very much captured like some very huge success stories from a very narrow sliver of game history where like prior to when that documentary was made, indie games kind of were on hiatus for about 20 years. They kind of existed. There were still direct sales on the web, whatever. It was not at all XBLA, indie games on the App Store, Steam, all that stuff had not exploded in the way it had. And like these are people who are ripe in the opportunity up in the situation to like really capitalize on that, reach a enormous audience, get platformers, stakeholders kind of involved in the process. Enormous great success stories. Again, like, oh, I love those games and I love those people and there's no objection to any of that. But people now watch that movie 5 years, 10 years later, and what they're going to do is they're going to emulate Tommy or John Blow or these other people. And like, I was in that world and like, that world is not how things work right now anymore. It was not how things worked as of like 2012, let alone 2018.
That's why I think we should probably look at the attention graph. It's one of the things that Gary Vaynerchuk sometimes says, like focusing on where the attention really is currently. Like maybe a few years ago, there was attention on the App Store, but now there isn't as much as it used to be.
Well,
it's getting more clear.
Well, so this is something, and I do agree that, I mean, part of what people have to look for is, like one of my friends, Jake Burkett's great about this, greatly in games for Regency Solitaire and Shadowhand, whatever, is he pays close attention to like which storefronts make sense for the kind of game he's selling. Like Itch and GOG and Steam and App Store, whatever, like these are not the same audience. These are not the same demographic and the same mood and the same buying experience and the same price level, whatever. And different kind of games have different fit in other places. And you know, oftentimes, understandably, developers will go out of their way to, as best they can, scatter shot, put their things where they can, put them in the humble, wherever they can get it. And then they'll at least watch those numbers. But almost all of them, it might be different where their spike is, but they're like, actually, 85% of my earnings actually come from this platform, so I'm glad I'm on it. But all these others combined are like nothing compared to it. But again, like the answer of which one that is depends on which developer it is and what kind of game they're shipping and the scale of it, etc. But yeah, so you know, partly it involves certainly looking where there's tension. I do agree again. So I want to go back to the earlier point of a lot of the way things kind of work anymore is really trying to build your own audience to have direct access to ideally a mailing list tends to convert better than social media following, whatever. But it's trying to figure out rather than be at the total mercy of the stakeholding platform. And this is also the fear everybody's got constantly of like, what if Steam changes its thing again like they do once every couple years? Or what if App Store changes its policy or whatever, or wipes out all the pre-64-bit apps again or whatever? Is like they don't want to be at the mercy of like a single company yanking out all of their earnings. Of like it'd be like, you know, because and this is how the world used to work before digital was be like, can I get shelf space through a publisher at Walmart, at Target, at whatever? And if it's like, oh, my game's, you know, too crazy, violent or whatever, so Walmart won't carry it, like...
So that's why you make your own website, so that you don't depend on those large companies?
Oh, so it's a bunch of it. Yeah, I mean, like a fractional income...
Like, Facebook actually cut off our reach a few years ago.
Oh, yeah. That's a great story example of, like, where this, like, Zynga exploded growth through, like, just, like, getting away with anything on Facebook until Facebook changed the rules to be like, and stop, because they don't want to lose people off their platform. And then Zynga, like, essentially kind of, like, crumbled under the weight of that was what they knew how to do. And yeah, even like, you know, it used to be like, oh, businesses were like, this is such an easy way to accumulate a following. We'll just do this. And now literally Facebook charges us to access our own reach of audience on their platform that said they wanted to hear from us because they can just tweak and change that rule anytime they feel like it. And
but in a way, they did create one of the best advertising platforms.
Oh no, it's enormously well. It's scary, scarily well targeted. In a way that like I think a lot of people don't realize just how much shenanigans go on in targeting of Facebook ads. It's damn near dangerous.
Between 25, 34 a year.
Oh no, it's way worse than that. It's way worse than that. That'd be fine with that. Hell, you know, I'll sign a survey and be like, here's my age, here's my approximate mix of ethnicities. Like I don't care, whatever. Like the challenge is literally. So I know a couple guys who look like their specialty is online advertising, paid whatever's kind of back end and whatever. And the first thing he was like, hey, okay, do you have a mailing list? And I was like, I've got an old mailing list before I was kind of growing the more recent other one for this other purpose. And he's like, all right, well, send me that, and I'll have the database just kick me out a whole bunch of other names of people who are like those people. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah. Apparently there's a whole bunch of ways that marketing people can just be like, okay, take this pile of thousands of names, find me thousands of different email addresses that are similar to those people. What does it even mean? I don't know. Marketing people have some idea. Apparently some do it, buying habits, demographic, geolocation, whatever, is to say like they're right around that same point as these people to then try to target advertise to them on Facebook or otherwise, and like uncomfortably bizarre that is something that goes on. But like when these devices
But
track,
you don't quite take into account how much work it took to make those few thousands people in the list.
yeah. I mean, and again, it's not really so much objecting to it so much as coming to terms with like what's going on is super targeted. It certainly has changed the game for, and again, the upside to these things is that like compared to used to be advertising was like, can you get a TV commercial? Which like my wife works in marketing for TV commercials for luxury SUVs or whatever. My business is probably not going to get a Super Bowl ad. Like, but there's companies that do. It used to be like that was the only way to market was like billboards or whatever. But
Television,
yeah,
radio.
television, radio ads, and it was just like way out of the budget of small business, and that's again lent us to be further dependent on outside capital to like which wealthy person can I beg to take a bet on me. And instead now like you can spend really, really low amounts to like really, really target ads. But more often than not, I think that people worry too much too soon about that, unless that's their focus. If somebody's like, again, gunning for like, I'm trying to make a profitable business, I'm a marketing person, that's my expertise, that's the service I'm in, by all means, go for it. But a lot of people, if they're coming out from the creative side, they want to make a thing, they want whatever. I think what happens is they get side.
I think.
Or go ahead.
About this, it's great because now the cost of entry is free. You can start making your own stuff and building an audience. Like we couldn't do that before.
I mean, for what it's worth, like John Carmack was talking about, like in the '90s, that like anybody with a computer can just like start programming a game. Like the barriers are down. Apogee was like just some guy they knew in Texas with a mailing address. So sort of again, but I think it undersells the significant difference between what's happening when it's just like me making a game versus like there is an entire floor of people in multiple buildings whose problem is, how do we make sure customers are aware that this is coming out, when it's coming out, that they want to buy it, putting it in front of the right kind of people, getting the press attention on schedule, and also sometimes feeding that same sort of thing back into the development of the product to like making sure it's positioned so that when it comes out, it's going to be a hit or otherwise. There's this very different machinery that goes on to make that happen in a way that's easy to kind of have in our blind spot if all we're focused on is, from a consumer side, the play experience, the game, the fun of it, whatever. There's very much this disconnect from this feeling where it's like, I use them because it's such an iconic example. Me and Mido being like, oh, when he was a child, he'd like to kind of explore out in the woods and want to kind of recreate that joy through Zelda or something, which is like awesome. But like every person who's got a childhood story of like, I hung out in the creek in my backyard and it was kind of fun, like that's not going to become Legend of Zelda. There was other timing factors, literal warehouses full of human beings screwing carts together, shipping internationally translated products. Like it was a different circumstance than what we're currently contesting against.
The personal details of your actual story.
Yeah. And it very much was. It's just a different environment now of either fighting for attention or again trying to figure out like how do I carve out my niche, find my people, develop as direct relationship to them as I can.
All right. There's just one more thing.
Sure.
And this question actually changed along the way. I'm going to make it different.
Okay.
Differently. All right. We saw that two things are extremely important. Number one, consistency, and number two, expectations.
Yep.
If you were to compare these two, which one will be a bit more important than the other?
Sure. I feel like they're important in different ways, so let me try to talk my way through this and see where we wind up. The important thing about expectations is not getting knocked out of it. That like if expectations wind up unrealistic, even sometimes it's flat out financially. Like
that's the reason you quit. After all.
What did you say?
That's the reason you end up quitting.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, in either literally like they just blew their savings on paying for assets for a game that like is not going to make back its costs, or they just like take such a morale hit of they have their heart set on like this is my magnum opus as my second project or whatever, and then it's not, and they just feel like out of it and they don't ever want to touch games again. Like that's part of the fear about expectations. But the fear from the side of consistency is that, like, again, like that's how skills stick. That's how skills develop. That's how we find opportunities that are like seem like they're conveniently timed because anytime is the right time if you're always doing it. It's how we accumulate progress over time. But I guess I'd have put expectations ahead of that, since if expectations are out of whack, then like it's over. I think a lot of
But
my
at the same time,
or good.
at the same time, if you actually don't have consistency, then you're not doing the work in the first place.
Oh, totally. Well, I consistent. Oh, so I guess this is where a lot of people who I've seen more recently, I think they're past the sort of naive confusion about, like, you know, maybe in 2010 we had much more kind of just lemmings off the cliff, wasting money on projects on a commercial scale. But we have instead right now today a lot of people who they're not consistent, but they also don't have unrealistic expectations, and that's where they'll kind of dip their toes in a few game jams a year. They'll kind of like come and go from stuff. They'll kind of like have some bookmarks to like cool articles about game dev. They kind of tinker with it, but that's still a point from which they can like pick up speed, join a like collaborative group like my club or someone else's team structure, join a university, whatever, find peers in their hometown, work together with some sort of consistency. But consistency can develop out of that because they didn't have unrealistic expectations, so it didn't knock them out of it. If no matter how consistent they are, or good.
So if you actually have the right expectations, then you might end up developing passion along the way.
Basically. Totally. Yeah. Well, yeah. And this very much is part of the reason why we encourage kind of low investment risk, exploratory, follow your interest, whatever, is I try to think of the example of like high school athletics, where like anyone playing high school basketball, football, soccer, baseball, whatever, like conceivably might become a professional. Most will not. But like if they don't, it's fine. It wasn't time wasted. It wasn't time lost. It wasn't time poorly spent. It was like this awesome, fun part of their life. They got memories from it, made some friendships through it, learned some skills, learned some stuff about themselves through it. Like, healthy. That's wonderful. What'd you say?
Healthy.
Yeah, it's healthy for them. And like, and they're doing it. And it's real. It's legitimate. They're exercising. They're getting benefits out of it. But they also didn't like not make plans to apply to school because like instead they just like are counting on this like, I'm going pro any day now, is kind of like potentially disastrous for most people who like that's just not how the market's going to sustain human being energy. So I don't know. I'm a big fan of that, where it's like, okay, do it because you like doing it. Do it because it's fun. Do it because you're enjoying it. Some people figure out they have a huge knack for it and they're just killing it and they're way ahead of everybody else. And that's, again, the benefit of the peers to compare to is not just for like pacing ourselves when we're totally beginners, but also because that can help you figure out like, maybe I am kind of special. Maybe I am kind of like just destroying. Like when I started that first club at Carnegie Mellon back, or kind of helped get it established, built our processes, whatever, back in 2004, it was something that I came out of my little hometown, Missouri. I had never been able to program games. I went to like a world-leading computer science program, and I was like, surely I will find some other people here who are also making games and all this other kind of stuff. And what I found was like some other people like had some kind of like unfinished prototypes, had kind of like some really, really tiny side projects, but like I had a huge head start on them. And I was like compared to my peers, I actually am doing kind of unusually well here in a way that I couldn't have told if I didn't have a peer group. Because instead I would have looked at the world around me and been like, but I am nowhere near the commercial products that I'm seeing on shelves. And I didn't know how to gauge my progress or whatever. But obviously, again, the important thing there was my answer to that wasn't to be like, oh, I feel superior. It was to like, how can I help catch everybody else up so we have like a stronger network? Because that's the other thing about, we talked about networking earlier. Like one of the best things you can do for your network is, rather than kind of like, and obviously this is like not an easy thing to do, but ideally, rather than just like kind of like make connections and hope they do well, make connections and then try to help everybody you know do better. Because like that's your network. And so like when my clubs would produce people who'd go on to work on like God of War and that game company's journey and whatever, like those are connections that I have because like I helped get them some momentum rolling or going, that kind of stuff. And
because you contributed value. That's why they ended up being connections.
But and again, but like in the clubs, it's maybe easier to reference specifically, but it also includes like when I do things like the podcast episodes, whatever, it's also partly it's helping them out. It's also helping my audience out, helping me out, but also helping increase the value of my network. Like everyone that's in my network, I've got 90 some odd episodes that are reviewed of like people who have been on another podcast, and that makes it easier for them to get on other podcasts. They're like, oh yeah, you know, I was on GameDev, GameKeto community and blah, 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 and helps them feel more comfortable with it and that kind of stuff. But yeah, so, you know, finding ways to improve the value of your network, which like is not just a selfish thing, but legitimate is also because like the answer to doing that is help other people do better, achieve more, that kind of stuff.
And I think that there's this thing when people don't connect others between them because they think they've got nothing to get from that.
Right. Yeah. No. That's certainly a huge amount of what I do is that. And I figured that earlier on because some other people helped do that for me in terms of just like making connections between people, and that's part of the value of networking at something like GDC, is not just paying close attention to like who's relevant to me, either A now because they might be in the future, but B to someone else who I've met so far. And this is where again I still find the business cards handy because it's easier for me to rifle through the 5 people I met that day in my pocket than it is to me to be like, okay, it was Simon something. And like that narrows it down to like 40 on my Facebook chain. And I'm like, sorry, I'm never going to figure out who this was. But yeah, being able to put those two together is helpful to them. Also becomes like, again, especially over time, people change lines of work, people change companies, people change whatever. And suddenly you wind up with somebody who like they're back in academia. And at the time you didn't know a connection was useful to them, but now you do. It's easy to make those introductions. Just helps everybody out.
Awesome. That's pretty much everything. It was awesome.
Excellent. Thanks for taking time to chat today.
Yeah,
Nice.
absolutely.